Hi, everyone. This is Dan O'Neill, the Executive Director of the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum. Before we get to our third Sunday presentation, I would like to thank the following businesses for sponsoring today's lecture. They made a vital investment in our museum, and their support is why we are able to bring you this lecture series at no charge. This month, we are really excited to bring you Jess Robinson. Jess is Vermont State Archaeologist. He works within the Division for Historic Preservation in Montpelier. Jess received his bachelor's in anthropology and English from the University of Vermont in 1999, his master's in literature from the University of Kent in 2001, his master's in anthropology from the University at Albany, SUNY in 2008, and his PhD in anthropology from the University at Albany, SUNY in 2015. During that time, Jess was also a research supervisor at the University of Vermont's Consulting Archaeology program. As the state archaeologist, Jess is centrally concerned with the stewardship, preservation, and interpretation of Vermont's rich archaeological past. His own research explores issues surrounding Native American long-distance material exchange, ritual elaboration, and social crises, as these phenomena are evidenced in the Northeastern archaeological record. He has authored or co-authored a number of journal articles, book chapters, conference papers, and technical reports about these and other topics. We are very pleased to bring you Jess Robinson.
Hey folks, thanks for letting me join you today. I love giving presentations at the Ethan Allen Homestead. Done it a few times over recent years, and I'm sorry that we can't be doing it in person. Hopefully pretty soon, if not I, then others will be able to, but I'm happy to have been asked, and I'm happy to be presenting today on a topic that I've been thinking about various parts of it for a while, and the synthesis today, such as it is still an ongoing thought work, and it was spurned on partially by Fred Wiseman's work in Seeds of Renewal and in early agriculture, and I thought I'd present some new information about that to you, and also just bring up some new or relatively recent research on the Woodland Period in Vermont. So the Woodland Period in Vermont is roughly defined between 3,000 years and right to the time of European contact, or right around 400 years before present. Obviously, those are both moving targets on either end, but in as much as we try to have some typological boundaries on these things, which certainly in the real world probably had very little meaning at all, it divides the past into chunks that we can take a closer look at. Again, not only in Vermont, but in Northeastern archaeology, this is roughly 3,000 years ago to the time of European contact. So the earliest part of this, the early Woodland Period, is quite interesting. And while some of these dates, as I just said, are arbitrary, some things were occurring right around 3,000 years ago, beginning around 3,000 years ago, that were really quite interesting. One was that an interregional interaction sphere emerged, not in necessarily utilitarian materials, but in non-utilitarian materials. Slate that was turned into pendants and different sorts of ornamental objects, copper that was turned into beads and other ornamentation for the body, or sometimes as sort of display objects. Galena, or a lead ore that was primarily, we believe, used for paint and pigment, perhaps on the body, perhaps for other things. Lithic materials, but that were often not utilized for your everyday spear point or arrow point, but rather were made into elaborate, sometimes quite large, or what archaeologists call hypertrophic spear points that were probably ceremonial or sociologically important, pipestone that was turned into smoking pipes, which obviously had a cosmological ritual and social significance as well. And I'm not going to dwell on this aspect. I've actually talked about this a bit before, but it is notable that Vermont and the Champlain Valley was really a kind of a nexus of where a lot of these far-flung trading routes were. And that's evidenced in some of the ceremonial and religious and cemetery sites we see in Vermont. And most of these material did end up in Native American cemeteries as far as we understand, but there are a few that were not, that have been found in non-cemetery contexts, including a copper axe found in Lake Salem, likely from drift copper from Michigan, and a ceremonial blade of Ramachurt found along the Missisquoi about 50 years ago in Berkshire. But the other interesting thing that happened around 3,000 years ago was the emergence of ceramic technology in the region, and not just in this region, but in the Great Lakes region, in the Appalachians, in the Ohio Valley. Everywhere, pottery began to be produced around this time. And it was very distinctive pottery. One, it had all the hallmarks of sort of early experimentation. Much of the pottery that's from this time period is quite small, almost drinking cup sized vessels. Much of it was kind of poorly made, as if they were starting to experiment with these new technologies. And it has some characteristic attributes, most notably fabric impressions on the interior of the vessel and the exterior of the vessel that might have served as some kind of decoration, but also helped get the air bubbles out of the pottery, and was actually a technique that was practiced intermittently right up until European contact and beyond. My colleague Charlie Paik, when he did a replicative study of Native American ceramic technology, using really only the materials that they would have had to have been available to them, noted when you were firing this pottery that there really was an interesting cosmological or ritual aspect to it, if you were so inclined, in that the pottery itself begins to glow, takes on a lot of attributes. And so while pottery certainly was and became definitely a very utilitarian implement, important for everyday life, a technological revolution in a lot of ways, we also can't forget that it was probably, especially in these beginning times, a really probably socially and perhaps cosmologically or ritually loaded event when these pots were constructed. But also, as I said, this pottery was impressed with fabric, which then, if you take clay and you carefully apply it to a good fragment of the pottery that preserves that impression, you can actually reconstruct through these negative impressions what this ancient fabric would have looked like. And you can reconstruct, as my mentor Jim Peterson did, the weave and the weft, the kinds of fabric that were made, the different technologies that came into it. But one of the most fundamental attributes that is preserved in this is what is called cordage twist. And this is simply taking two plies of a fabric and you either twist it one way, which is often called S twist, or if you twist it the opposite way, counterclockwise, it's called a Z twist. It doesn't matter which direction you flip the cordage, it will always look this way. And this is a sort of patterning that's really almost unconscious. Ethnographic studies of different indigenous groups, normally fabric is created by women, although not exclusively, and what they documented was that women teach their daughters to either roll the cordage up the thigh or roll the cordage down the thigh. There's not a lot of conscious thought that goes into this, but nevertheless, there is this difference taught through learning networks through generations. And my mentor and real important person in Vermont and Northeastern archaeology, Jim Peterson, while he was in graduate school, published with his colleague Nate Hamilton a survey of these cordage twist directions during this early woodland period. And if there was anything that you could get in terms of potential ethnicity or social difference in the way that this cordage was made. And I readdressed this a couple of years ago to see if those interpretations still held up, and also add to the existing corpus of documented cordage twist directions in the Northeast. And so we'll just go through a few here. The Missisquoi Wildlife Refuge headquarters and porcupine sites, which we'll talk about again in a minute, had some really remarkable vessel fragments of this Vinette 1 pottery. You can see here vessel 19, dated to roughly 2,350 years ago, had an twist cordage throughout. Just some other early woodland deposits at the porcupine site at Route 78. Canaan Bridge site, which was excavated in the early 1990s. I'll just go through some slides here. A very important early woodland site and early middle woodland site. Lots of fire-cracked rock features, the remains of a lot of nuts, including butternut, important fish remains, a really important site for this period, especially on the Upper Connecticut. But it also contained Vinette 1 pottery, dated to 2,550 years ago, plus or minus, with a distinct S-twist cordage. Another site in Newbury on the Connecticut, the Carson Farm site, again, dated to a very similar timeline, had S-twist cordage as well. And so those were just a few of the sites I added to this database that Jim Peterson and Nathan Hamilton had already compiled, and looked across the eastern woodlands, but here is just the New England region. And I'll highlight in a minute this local region, but what you can see here is very much affirming what Jim Peterson and Nate Hamilton saw in the mid-80s, which is that the dark blue indicates mostly or fully S-twist cordage at sites, except with the notable exception of the Isle La Motte Cemetery up in Isle La Motte. You can see a very strong predominance of S-twist cordage, all in the interior, certainly in Vermont and New Hampshire, in southern New England as well, but then in the Gulf of Maine, a very distinct cordage difference. And this affirms what Peterson and Hamilton were discussing, which that there does seem to be, at least by this one marker, a very interesting ethnic difference on the Maine coast that might have been a carryover all the way from the Archaic period, where the Maritime Archaic was located on this, that perhaps learning different networks were different, perhaps lineages. It's obviously difficult to say with this limited proxy, but there are others as well. And so it's a very interesting case of using very, very small technological attributes preserved in the archaeological record and making sort of synthetic and broad-reaching inferences, not definitive in any case. This is not looking at biological realities or anything, but does offer one line of evidence. And just, I love it as an interesting example of a very, very small attribute that can elucidate broad patterns in prehistory, or at least help to. So the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be moving on to food and environment, and some new interesting things that we are coming to light in the last few years and are still very much being thought about and ruminated on. And also a little bit about lithic procurement patterns in the late woodland period too. So while after the late Pleistocene, after about 10,000 years ago, the environment did become steady, much more regular than it had been during the long up and down dynamic swings of the Ice Age. Nevertheless, there were fluctuations in temperature. The previous slide you saw, just see that. Not great fluctuations in temperature, but enough that, as you can see here, forest compositions changed over time, temperature shifted, different plant and animal communities were on the ascendants or descendants. And that has important implications for how Native people, the Abnaki, and their neighbors lived in the past, how they could make out on the landscape, favorable locations for settlement, and all of these things that we can at least try to get at in the archaeological record. How environmental scientists piece the environment in the past together is largely through sediment cores and other proxies, but counting pollen percentages over time in lakes and ponds. And Vermont is pretty interesting, like some other New England states, in that we have a very distinct altitudinal gradient as well, where below about 1,800 feet, it's mixed woodland with a lot of deciduous forest trees among them. You can see the lower third of this photograph shows that, pines and coniferous trees mixed in with a lot of deciduous trees, but above 1,800 feet, you really get into boreal forest conditions. And then at the very tops of the greens or whites, you get in a few places a remnant Arctic tundra left over from the Pleistocene. And so really, as you're going uphill in Vermont, if you're going on a hike from Camel's Hump or Mount Abe, for instance, you're almost going back in time through forest conditions until, if you get to the tops of the mountains, you're looking at sort of an analog of what the late Pleistocene 11, 12,000 years ago would have looked like. But additionally, forests have changed over the last few hundred years, largely due to Euro-American impositions on the forest canopy, largely through cutting down. And this is an interesting study that was done by Thompson et al., including Charles Cogbill, that noted that the pre-colonial forest was really beech heavy, and then a strong gradient of oak down in southern New England. This red sort of tint here you can see is the predominance of beech. And that was most of the forest cover in Vermont, as you all probably know, was cut down for farming in the 19th century. And when it was regrown purposely, species were selected for a number of attributes, but including their economic importance. And of course, maple was replanted. And you can see this bright red is the predominance of maple in New England. And we can actually see that when we look. Oh, here's just a slide again showing the percentages of trees at around the time of European contact, as documented through Thompson et al. Cogbill. And you can see the predominance of beeches. Maples are next, spruces, and then things like butternut are almost non-existent. They are there, but you really have to hunt them out, and that informs what I'm about to say. Chestnut, very, very small. And of course, the archaeological record can help us inform what native folks were eating in the past and using for medicinal plants, what wood they were burning, and by extension, get indirectly at the environments in the past. And so this is a few years old now, and we're actually going to update this and fill it out a little bit more with new analyses. But we took 136 features where paleobotanical analyses have been done and plotted them, and then did some presence or absence. These aren't statistical averages, but are rather presence or absence, but are still quite interesting, just showing what a typical Native American feature would have looked like. And then here are tree species. And like Cogbill, you can see, again, these are incidences. These are not, statistical abundances, but Beech, very prominent from 5,000 years on, is the most prominent taxon in terms of number of specimens identified. Certainly, hop hornbeam is also important. Maple is important, but fluctuates through time, and different species down the line. But important, the forest character, as revealed through the presence of wood charcoal, shows or provides more evidence, like cogbill. Different types of nut species in Vermont that could be utilized for food. And again, we can see through time, again, these are incidences, but butternut in every single period was the predominant nut species being sought after, or at least as revealed in archaeological sites. Now, there could be some preservation issues. Butternut shells and nut meat might be more robust and so survive a little bit better. But nevertheless, it's an overrepresentation, given how in the previous couple slides I told you how rare butternut trees were in general in Vermont, which means that butternuts were a sought after nut and were probably not just haphazardly encountered, but people were going out on specific forays to gather these nuts and bring them back and processing them en masse. And so they might have been favored because of the fats and oils that contained within them. Perhaps they just tasted better, perhaps they preserved better, but they seem to have been overrepresented. And we'll get to some of that in a minute. And then cultigens. Yes, all the evidence confirms that corn or maize came in right around 1,000 years ago, around 1000 AD. We haven't found any samples of actual maize that predate that. But interestingly, Chenopodium or goosefoot seems to have been grown intermittently at least around 3,000 years ago. It's difficult to determine domesticated goosefoot from wild goosefoot, but it is represented in a lot of archaeological sites beginning around that time period and not before. So it makes sense that it was at least a low-level horticultural crop. We have one incidence of sunflower between 3,000 and 2,000 years ago at the headquarters site in Route 78, which we're going to get to in a minute. And then beans and squash as well. And then just notably, I mentioned the Carson Farm site before with the Vinette 1 pottery from the early Woodland period. A sample of that pottery was actually sampled by my colleague Karine Taché at Laval University, and was looking for the presence of lipids or fats preserved within the pottery matrix, and she identified clear freshwater fish fats in those in that pottery sherd, indicating that there are new technologies that we can leverage on pottery and other materials that can start to tell us more about the lifeways of the Proto-Abenaki and other Native American groups in the past. One other thing dating to that early time period I just want to mention is that this is from the Foot site in Cornwall, Vermont. You can see the feature I'm about to show you is this large area in yellow or yellow tan. This was excavated in the late 2000s, 2009, I believe, or maybe even a little bit earlier. But notably, this enormous roasting pit, which you can see spreads, at least the amount that they uncovered, spread over 20 or 30 square meters, and there's more in the intact ground. This is what it looked like in cross section, just an immense amount of fire-cracked rock and fire reddened and blackened soil, a lot of material in that, including a lot of nuts. This feature dated to roughly 3,100 years ago. And the presence and the use of these large roasting pits has been somewhat unclear, but recent research in the Pacific Northwest has indicated these were actually tuber roasting pits. And so while we don't have any evidence of the remains of tubers, because they don't preserve that well except for phytoliths and actually or starch grains, and we actually don't have anyone in this region that's looking for that material on a commercial basis that I can actually hire out to get those analyses done. It remains conjecture, but I believe that that is what these are. And so it's, again, if we can get some samples of that firecracked rock, which we have retained at the Vermont Archaeology Heritage Center, and get them analyzed, we might be able to tell a lot of different things about that. So I'm still looking. So for the final part of this talk, I wanted to move to the late Woodland period and just talk about a few things that we've seen for some recent reports done in this case largely by the Northeastern Archaeology Research Center and the UVM Consulting Archaeology Program. The late Woodland period dates from around 1,000 years ago to the time of European contact. And as I mentioned previously, was really the time when corn, bean, and squash agriculture comes into play. And a question has always been, what degree did lifeways change with the introduction of agriculture? What did it do? Did it shift native population settlement patterns? Did they become much more reliant on domesticated crops? And some recent sites are lending some insight into this that have been excavated in the last 5 to 10 years, but the reports have come in, over the last few years, and so some interesting new data here. Again, just a diagram of maize. Typical early depictions of native agriculture, in this case an Iroquoian group. A couple of quotes that provide some potential insight into the Abenaki and other groups in the Champlain Valley. They don't specifically say which side, so it's difficult to know, but this is Champlain saying that he saw plains productive in grain such as I had eaten in this country, together with many kinds of fruit without limit. Again, talking about cleared agricultural foods, growing domesticated crops, and then kinds of fruit, potentially referring to melons or squash. This is from Sanders, A History of the Indian Wars in 1828, notable because he was one of the first presidents of UVM. And so even though it was a nationwide early study, he spent a few chapters talking about native groups in Vermont. Quoting here, Indian cornfields are plainly to be seen in various parts of Vermont. In the intervals of Burlington, several hundred acres together were found by the American settlers, entirely cleared, not a tree upon them, the land's perfectly level, the soil made by vernal freshets. There can be no richer land. And then Pete Thomas, as part of his dissertation on the Fort Hill Sokoke site in the lower Vermont portion of the Connecticut, reconstructed a seasonal round based upon historic and ethnohistoric records of the Abenaki at that time. And yes, maize was important, both the growing season and then for storage, as were beans and squash, but so were a variety of other wild animals and plants. This is highlighting the animals here, and notably include deer throughout most of the season, dropping off a little bit in the summer, but moose, shad, salmon, small mammals, wild plants, waterfowl, all of these non-anadromous fish or non-running fish, all of these were important in the seasonal round, and indicating that unlike Iroquoian groups that really were transformed by agriculture, moved into sedentary villages, became very reliant on domesticated agricultural crops, that yes, maize, beans, squash were important, but still hunting and gathering, foraging were important components of the overall diet, and therefore probably had some some notable impact on settlements lifeways, as we might imagine. And so what archaeological evidence do we have for some of this? Well, I talked about this before, I believe, at the Ethan Allen Homestead, but the Route 78 Improvement Project, the headquarters of Porcupine sites in Swanton, Vermont, were really incredibly important for, and still are, for understanding pre-contact Abnaki lifeways in not only in the Swanton and Missisquoi region, but throughout all of Vermont, certainly in the Champlain Valley. This project was done in advance of a proposed road widening, as it has yet to happen yet along Route 78. Much of this was in the Missisquoi Wildlife Refuge, but not all of it. Radiocarbon dates spanning through the late Archaic and into all right up to the time of European contact. Many dates, these are from the phase 1 and 2, but there's actually many more now. We're still awaiting the phase 3 or the final volumes to be produced, because this was an enormous undertaking. And this slide here shows something that Ellie Cowie, the director of the Northeast Archaeology Research Center at the time, noted, which is that through time, you can see the earliest sites are the furthest upriver, closest to the town of Swanton now, and are very small. And not only do sites grow through time in terms of their size, by the blue is the middle woodland beginning around 2,000 years ago, going out further out in the delta. But by the late woodland period, they're going much farther out in the delta, likely utilizing these newly emerged or stabilized and dry floodplain areas for agriculture. The flood deposits preserve things not only very well, but also as a layer cake. So you can go down through time and see remarkably well preserved things, cases that are not always true at archaeological sites in Vermont. Among the most notable finds there was the first definitive longhouse identified in Vermont, dating to around 1200 AD, so quite early. Here's just a little video reconstruction, if I can get it going, about what this might have looked like. This is not to scale. This is just sort of impressionistic to imagine, for those of you who can't see the patterns here at home, what it might have looked like. And associated with this longhouse was, you can see these fine sediment layers are a midden or a sort of trash area along what was then probably the bank of the Missisquoi, preserving all sorts of food remains, waste materials as well, in terms of the remains of stone tool making, pottery fragments, all sorts of things that are preserved in this midden sediment. Among those, of course, was maize kernels and other parts, but also abundant wild rice, butternut, acorn, shagbark hickory nut, chenopodium or goosefoot again, grape, blueberry, and a variety of other wild plant foods. Animal remains included an abundance of deer, as is common throughout the entire archaeological record from the early Archaic 10,000 years ago, right up to the time of European contact, but also beaver, marten, and a variety of fish here as well. Notable, amazing collection of pottery throughout the early to the late woodland period. And our, Ellie Cowie from the Northeast Archaeology Research Center was just writing recently about some really interesting things that she's seeing in the pottery assemblage, because it's really unparalleled in Vermont. Characteristic late woodland spear points, or arrowheads probably by this time, called Lavana type, these triangular points. And you can see the predominance of this gray sparkly material called quartzite, but also here a darker chert called Hathaway Chert. And what's notable is this is the only site I'm going to be referring to in the next 15 minutes or so, where Hathaway Chert is represented in any abundance in the late woodland assemblage. And that doesn't seem that surprising because the source of Hathaway Chert is in the St. Albans area and on some of the islands in this St. Albans Bay. So it's very close. But we're going to see an interesting pattern when we go to some other sites. And this is just a late woodland pipe on the right fragment showing smoking pipes were represented as well. Moving close to the Ethan Allen Homestead, the Donahue or Corncob site has a very similar pattern. And what I'm showing here in both the previous site and now is those sites that are on the lowest reaches of the major rivers, the big deltas, the probably the most fertile areas, where we would expect the largest late woodland settlements to be because of the fertile floodplains, but also potentially some dynamic areas. And I can show you this slide here, where this is a schematic of the Winooski River, and the dark area is 1802. It's tracked through the intervale. 1830 is slightly lighter blue. 1869 is even lighter blue, and then the modern is the lightest blue. And you can see even through the intervale area how much the Winooski River has meandered. And when it meanders like that, archaeological sites that were formerly on the edges would be destroyed. Conversely, you can see the green and the red arrows indicate areas. The red arrows indicate former channels, that's LIDAR, that are hundreds of years old, and the green arrows indicate channels that are potentially thousands of years old. And you can see that the native Proto-Abenaki archaeological sites in the Delta really correspond to these former and occasionally current channels. So proximity to these lower reaches was quite important. The Donahue site was radiocarbon dated to approximately 1415 AD. And again, there was important maize here, and we'll get to that in the next slide, but there was also an abundance of butternuts, acorns, grape, deer, and fish. Donahue site is currently the only site in Vermont where intact maize cobs and partial cobs were recovered, meaning that they were almost certainly grown locally, because from everything we understand, cobs or corn kernels were quickly processed into flour or other food stuff. And so what this indicates is that this corn was likely grown locally. Unfortunately, when it was found in the late 1970s, they covered all of the materials with glue, which makes radiocarbon dating or other analyses pretty difficult or impossible. Also, you can see a preserved in dirt matrix on the lower left, a deer mandible, again indicating the importance of hunting. And these quartzite lavanas, one is a dark chert from the southern Lake Champlain area, and quartzite scraping tools, and then characteristic late woodland incised pottery. So those are the lower reaches. Then we move up into the mid reaches. Above the falls, in this case of along the Winooski River, we get to South Burlington and a site near the airport, excavated in advance of a road alignment change. And this site was quite remarkable, not along the floodplain, but on a much higher terrace right near sort of the base of the airport, but a very, very large late woodland Abenaki site. Can see the profiles here. We don't have to get into that, but below the modern road fill, immediately adjacent to the road, you can see the bottle sticking out there, showing the modern fill in the lower right of the photo was this dense, what we call anthracite or Native American living surface, filled with artifacts. And underneath that were definitive features: storage pits, refuse pits, fire hearths. I don't have a picture of the actual lavanas from this, but out of 113 recovered from this site, from the phase 3 excavations, all but 3 were made from quartzite. Notable again, we'll get to that in a minute. You can see the map in one of the main concentrations here of one of the blocks of the fire pits, the storage pits, the refuse pits. One of these pits was a very telltale bell-shaped storage pit, completely empty of food remains, but likely used for storing corn. And the heat map on the right shows where all of the artifacts were found, and the densest areas were in this concentration of features. We didn't find any post molds or an alignment like they found on Route 78, but we do hypothesize that it was this locus was probably a longhouse type structure, perhaps not as long or as large as that was found on the Missisquoi. Another locus of the site, which I'll show you the map in a minute, was much less clear. No features were found, but a real abundance of flakes and lithic debitage, and then on the right, the Lavana type arrowheads found along there. And excavations were only conducted for the road alignment, and so you see where these 2 blocks were, where the road is going, with the white underlying it, the heat map underlying it. But all of those blue dots indicated areas where artifacts were found. They're currently preserved in place, but you can see the probable size of this settlement, really huge. And those green squares that you see were radiocarbon dated materials, including maize all the way up in the current forest, butternut again represented, and all of them came out to 1315 AD. So what do we see here? Off the floodplain, probably a settlement that was very large, probably dated in the winter. Maize materials were represented, but not in overabundance, and nuts were equally as common. We'll just go through these quickly. Again, even further up in Jonesville at the confluence of the Huntington and the Winooski, this site radiocarbon dated to approximately 1500. No maize here at all, but a huge amount of butternuts. In fact, this perhaps was one of these collection and processing places, but also a great variety of not only really characteristic pottery, high predominance of quartzite, bare remains. You can just see a few excavation photos here. Again, these important floodplain sediments preserving these ancient settlements in pretty good context. A couple excavation photos on the right, but then all of the food remains that they got, or animal remains: bear, deer, beaver, porcupine, skunk, fisher, rabbit, muskrat, mink, squirrel, chipmunk. So still quite a sizable site. We can't really get at the numbers of residents at this site, but pretty sizable, characteristic of the late woodland period, but much more focused on hunting and nut collection. Moving to the Otter Creek in the last 5 minutes or so, I'm gonna have to really hurry. This is a note from Peter Kalm, and when he went over, he was an early explorer, went to Fort St. Frederick in the 1730s, went over to what is now Port Henry and looked across the lake to along the Otter Creek and up towards the Green Mountains, and saw fires burning. And you can see this quote here, which he later attributed to Native Americans trying to drive game, but much more likely they were probably clearing areas for agriculture, or a combination of both. And we've recently seen that, again, not at the mouths of the Otter Creek in this case, but mid-reaches in Weybridge, at places like the Wyman Island site, VT AD 44. Again, remarkably preserved floodplain settlements. Again, these were done in advance of a dam relicensing, and so only areas that were subject to heavy erosion, and really only along the eroding banks, were the excavations conducted. So we don't have a full view of the fields. This is impact specific. But even that, remarkable evidence at a number of sites for maize, yes, but also chenopodium, elderberry, blueberry. You can see the remains here. And an overabundance of quartzite and the complete absence of Hathaway chert. Pottery from this site. One more, the Wyman Island site in Weybridge as well, again for dam relicensing. The features at this site were almost all late woodland in age. Many of them contain maize, but also a number of nut and wild plant seeds, domesticated bean, sunflower, dated throughout various portions of the late woodland period. And again, a very overabundance of quartzite. And because I'm running out of time, I'll just show a couple more sites here. Moving to the Lamoille and Milton, right up near the Peterson Dam. No maize here, but a variety of fish, deer, and beaver remains from a number of different features or fire hearths. And an overabundance of quartzite here as well. And finally, the last category of site were much more hunting related, up off the floodplains into the high terraces and the woodlands. Very, very small sites, but one of the most notable at Camp Johnson was a very small site in terms of its aerial extent or geographic extent, very tight. But within this, roughly dated to around 1315 AD, a huge number, in this case, totally quartzite arrowheads, and a lot of deer, marten, and bird remains, showing that this was probably a hunting camp, probably 1, 2, 3 individuals for a few days. And I won't show the last site, but to sum up, what we have discovered over the last few years, and it's the Royal Reeve, we have to really, give all due credit to the consultants, NEARC and UVM CAP, doing this work, is that the lower floodplains, the lower delta reaches of the rivers were certainly intense focus areas, probably had the largest settlements, but there were settlements on the mid reaches of these rivers. They probably were growing maize, at least intermittently as well. That it wasn't all focused on the lower reaches, and that there's very intense but small in aerial extent focused hunting and extraction camps as well, and that the entire landscape seems to have been well parsed out. And why I highlighted the quartzite is that relative to the previous middle woodland period, there is a distinct shift towards this material that outcrops in abundance, but not really in the northern greens. It outcrops in the central and southern greens, and yet it is far, far overrepresented at almost every large late woodland site we've seen, with the notable exception of the headquarters and porcupine sites, which are again along the Missisquoi, hinting at perhaps some sort of territoriality, some shift towards those areas. Begins really right around the start of the late woodland period, so we're not quite sure what to make of that yet, but it's an interesting line of inquiry. And so with that, I think I'll stop sharing my screen and hand it back to Dan.
Next month, we are really excited to bring you Shelby Ballack. Shelby is a history professor at Metropolitan State University in Denver, and she has agreed to present on women and religion on the Vermont frontier for this month.
And as always, if you enjoyed this presentation and would like to support the Ethan Allen Homestead, please go to the donation link in the description box below or on our website, ethanallenhomestead.org. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next month.